There was a moment, a single, breathless moment in the long history of the ancient world, when the mightiest civilization ever built by human hands began to die. Not with an explosion, not with a single battle, not even with a single sword. It began with a decision. One man, standing at the crossroads of a crumbling empire, chose a path, and that choice sent a civilization of 1,000,000 square miles into a slow, grinding, irreversible collapse that the world would not recover from for 1,000 years. This is the story of that decision. To understand how Rome fell, you have to understand what Rome was at its height, because nothing in history had ever looked quite like it. At the peak of its power, in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the ancient cities of Syria. It was home to roughly 70 million people, nearly a third of the entire human population of the Earth. Its roads, paved with stone and engineered with breathtaking precision, ran for over 250,000 miles, connecting every corner of the empire in a web of commerce, communication, and military power. Cities that had never known running water, public baths, or the rule of law were transformed within a generation into gleaming provincial capitals. The Mediterranean Sea, Mare Nostrum, the Romans called it, our sea, was, for all practical purposes, a Roman lake. Trade flowed freely across it. Grain from Egypt fed the capital, silk from the east, silver from Spain, wine from Gaul. The empire was not just a political entity. It was a machine, a civilization-generating machine of staggering efficiency and brutality and genius. At its center stood the city of Rome itself, 1,000,000 people living within a single urban boundary, a density and scale the Western world would not see again until London in the 19th century. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 spectators. The Pantheon, with its breathtaking concrete dome, still stands today as one of the greatest architectural achievements in all of human history. The Forum was the beating heart of the known world. Senators draped in white and purple togas debated the fate of nations in marble halls. Generals returning from conquest were greeted with triumphs. Massive, thunderous parades through the city's streets, with captive kings marching in chains before cheering crowds who had never known defeat. Rome did not believe it could fall. Why would it? Nothing had ever stopped it. Carthage, destroyed. Greece, absorbed. Gaul, conquered in 8 years by a single general named Julius Caesar. The Germanic tribes across the Rhine pushed back, again and again, across decades of brutal border warfare. The Parthian Empire in the east checked, balanced, negotiated with. Rome bent. Rome adapted. Rome absorbed. For 5 centuries, there had been no challenge it could not eventually overcome, no crisis it could not survive, no enemy it could not outlast, or out-organize, or simply crush beneath the weight of its incomprehensible logistical power. And then came the 3rd century. If the 2nd century was the golden age of Rome, the age of the 5 good emperors, of Marcus Aurelius writing philosophy by lamplight in his tent on the Danube frontier, of Hadrian building his wall across northern Britain just because he could, then the 3rd century was its nightmare. Historians have a name for it. They call it the crisis of the 3rd century. And that name does not begin to capture the horror of what it actually was. Between the years 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire had, depending on how you count, somewhere between 26 and 50 different emperors. That is not a typo. In a span of 50 years, Rome went through more rulers than most dynasties manage in 5 centuries. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. Most of those emperors did not die peacefully in their beds. They were assassinated. They were killed in battle, not by barbarian enemies, but by their own soldiers, by their own generals, by rivals who emerged from the legions like weeds from cracked stone, each one believing that he alone could restore the empire's glory, each one lasting just long enough to discover that the machine was already breaking down in ways no single man could fix. This was the chaos. This was the crack in the foundation that would, 2 centuries later, swallow everything. But to find the true decision, the single pivotal act that made Rome's fall not just possible but ultimately inevitable, we need to go back even further, to the man who, more than any other individual in Roman history, shaped the empire's final fate. Not Nero, not Caligula, not even Julius Caesar. We need to talk about Diocletian. In 284 AD, a soldier named Diocletian clawed his way to power through the blood and chaos of the 3rd century's endless civil wars. He was a brilliant man, a practical man, a man who looked at a dying empire and said, "We can fix this." And in many ways, he was right. His administrative reforms were extraordinary. He stabilized the currency, reorganized the army, restructured the tax base, and managed, through sheer force of will and political genius, to hold the empire together against the odds. He even, in a remarkable act of personal discipline almost unheard of in Roman history, voluntarily abdicated power in 305 AD, the only Roman emperor ever to do so, and retired to grow cabbages in his palace on the Adriatic coast. But Diocletian also made a decision that seemed, at the time, like the only rational response to an impossible problem. And it was that decision, more than any battle, any plague, any barbarian invasion, that planted the seed of Rome's final destruction. He divided the empire in 2, not permanently, in his own thinking, not as a death sentence. He called it the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. The idea was elegant in its logic. The empire was simply too large for one man to govern effectively. By the time a message traveled from Rome to the Danube frontier, or from Rome to Syria, or from Rome to Britain, weeks had passed. Months, sometimes. Crises erupted and festered and exploded before the emperor even heard about them. The legions on distant frontiers needed immediate leadership, immediate decision-making, immediate imperial authority. The empire needed to be governed from the field, not from a marble throne in a city that was increasingly more symbolic than strategic. So Diocletian appointed a co-emperor, a man named Maximian, to govern the western half of the empire. He himself would govern the east. Each would have a junior emperor beneath him, a Caesar in training, ready to succeed. 4 rulers, 4 power centers, 1 empire. The logic was impeccable. The consequences were catastrophic. Here is what Diocletian did not fully understand, or perhaps understood and chose to ignore, because the alternative seemed worse. He was not just dividing an administrative burden. He was dividing an identity. Rome's power had never been merely military or economic. It had been psychological. It had been the idea, the tremendous, intoxicating, civilization-defining idea that there was one Rome, one law, one order, one people under one authority. That idea had held together Greek and Roman, Jew and Gentile, Gaul and Egyptian and Syrian in a single political body for 5 centuries. Legions had died for that idea. Cities had been built for that idea. The moment you said, in practice and in structure, that there were 2 Romes, even if you claimed in theory that they were still one, you began to dissolve the psychological cement that had held the whole thing together. And almost immediately, it began to crack. Diocletian abdicated in 305, as planned. His carefully designed succession system collapsed almost instantly. Within a year, the empire had not 4 claimants to power, but 6. Within another decade, the succession wars had consumed most of those claimants in blood, and a new figure had emerged to dominate the Roman world. His name was Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, the man who moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, a new city he built from scratch on the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, on the ancient Greek town of Byzantium. A city he designed, with every intention and every symbol, to be the new Rome, the true Rome, the eternal Rome. And in doing so, he completed what Diocletian had begun. Because here is what Constantine's move meant in practice. It meant that the ancient city of Rome, the physical heart of the empire, the place where the legions had been born, where the Republic had deliberated, where the emperors had ruled for 3 centuries, was no longer the center of Roman power. The city that had given its name to the civilization, that had been the gravitational core around which everything else orbited, was now, effectively, a provincial capital. Important symbolically, rich still, magnificent still, but no longer the seat of real power. Real power now lived in the East, in Constantinople, in the new Rome on the Bosphorus. The West was left to manage itself. This might have worked. Enormous empires have managed decentralized governance before and since. But what Constantine's move did, what it could not avoid doing, was shift the allocation of resources, military attention, and imperial will toward the eastern half of the empire and away from the western half. The wealthier provinces, the more stable provinces, the provinces with deeper urban roots and more robust economies, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, were all in the east. The West had Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. Valuable, yes, but increasingly expensive to defend and increasingly dependent on a central government that was now physically and psychologically oriented away from them. The legions defending the Rhine and Danube frontiers, the long, cold, impossibly expensive border that separated the Roman world from the Germanic tribal confederacies to the north, began to feel the thinning of imperial attention. It was subtle at first, a slightly delayed resupply, a slightly slower response to a breach in the border, a slightly less rigorous vetting of the soldiers recruited to fill the gaps in the frontier legions. And those gaps were growing. Because while Rome was consumed with its own internal politics, something extraordinary was happening on the other side of those rivers. The Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Saxons, the Burgundians, were changing. They were not the disorganized, technologically primitive warriors that Caesar had described in his dispatches from Gaul 3 centuries earlier. 3 centuries of contact with Rome had transformed them. They had absorbed Roman military techniques, Roman weapons, Roman organizational structures, Roman agricultural practices. They had grown in population, in wealth, in political sophistication, and they were being pushed. Far to the east, on the vast steppes of Central Asia, a new power was forming out of the wind and grass. The Huns, a nomadic confederation of terrifying military capability, horse archers of almost supernatural effectiveness, able to launch accurate arrow fire at full gallop in any direction, organized into a fighting force of extraordinary speed and coordination. In the 370s, the Huns swept westward out of the Pontic steppe and crashed into the Gothic kingdoms north of the Black Sea like a wave against stone. The Goths, suddenly facing an enemy they could not defeat, did the only thing they could do. They ran toward Rome. In 376 AD, a Gothic leader named Fritigern appeared at the banks of the Danube River with an enormous number of his people, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, and asked the Roman emperor for permission to cross the river and settle inside Roman territory. He offered to serve as Federate soldiers, to defend the frontier in exchange for land and safety. He was desperate. His people were starving and terrified, and had nowhere else to go. And the emperor, Valens, ruling the eastern half of the empire from Constantinople, said yes. This was the decision. This single act, the admission of a large, armed, unassimilated Gothic force into the interior of the Roman Empire, was not the first time Rome had settled barbarian peoples within its borders. Rome had a long tradition of using Germanic warriors as soldiers and settling tribal groups along the frontier as buffer populations. The Tetrarchy and Constantine's successors had continued this practice, but never before had Rome admitted such a large group so quickly under such desperate circumstances, without the infrastructure to manage them, without the political will to integrate them, and without, critically, the military dominance needed to enforce the terms of the agreement. Because what happened next was a catastrophe of Roman arrogance and administrative corruption. The officials tasked with supplying food to the Gothic refugees stole the provisions for personal profit and left hundreds of thousands of desperate, heavily armed people to starve on Roman soil. Fritigern's people, hungry and humiliated, rebelled. And in 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, in what is today northern Turkey, the Gothic forces destroyed the main Roman field army of the east. Emperor Valens himself was killed. The first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy in over a century. The army that had been the spine of Roman power on the Danube frontier was gone. The psychological shock was incalculable. Rome had lost battles before. Rome had survived Cannae, where Hannibal had destroyed 80,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. Rome had survived Teutoburg Forest, where 3 entire legions had been massacred in the German darkness. But it had always recovered, always rebuilt, always returned with greater force and terrible vengeance. This time was different. This time the empire did not have the resources, the political coherence, or the military manpower to simply rebuild. The Eastern government made peace with the Goths on terms that, for the first time in Roman history, allowed a large foreign people to live within the empire without being subject to Roman law, without being absorbed, without being Romanized, without giving up their own leadership, their own customs, their own identity. They were inside Rome, but they were not Roman. It was a wound that would not close. Over the following decades, the empire limped forward. Great generals, Stilicho, himself the son of a Vandal officer, commanding Roman armies with Roman titles and Roman authority, held the West together through a combination of military brilliance and desperate political maneuvering. But the structural problems that Diocletian's division and Constantine's relocation had created were now compounding themselves with the speed of a landslide. The tax base of the western provinces was eroding as Roman agriculture was disrupted by constant raiding and instability. The professional army, increasingly composed of Germanic Federate troops who owed personal loyalty to their commanders rather than institutional loyalty to the Roman state, was becoming less reliable as a political instrument. The bureaucracy, vast and expensive, consumed resources that the shrinking Western economy could no longer generate. And the emperors. The emperors in the West in the late 4th and 5th centuries were, with few exceptions, figures of almost tragic inadequacy for the moment they inhabited. Child emperors, puppet emperors, emperors controlled entirely by their generals or their mothers or their court factions, not monsters like Caligula or Nero, merely men overwhelmed by a crisis centuries in the making, men who lacked the vision or the power or the institutional support to make the decisions that might have changed the course of history. In 410 AD, Something happened that had not happened in 800 years. The city of Rome was sacked. A Visigothic army under a leader named Alaric, a man who had actually served in the Roman army, who had fought for Rome, who had repeatedly asked for a Roman military appointment and been repeatedly denied, breached the walls of the Eternal City and spent 3 days looting it. The physical destruction was not catastrophic. Most of the great buildings survived. Most of the population survived. But the psychological impact reverberated across the entire Mediterranean world. Saint Jerome, in his monastery in Bethlehem, wrote that he was struck dumb with horror when he heard the news. Augustine, in North Africa, began writing The City of God, partly as a response to the pagan accusation that Rome's conversion to Christianity had weakened it. The philosophical and theological wrestling with the question that was now screaming from every corner of the empire. How could this have happened? The answer was not one thing. It was never one thing. It was the accumulated weight of decisions made over generations: Diocletian's division, Constantine's relocation of the capital, the settlement of unassimilated federate peoples, the corruption of the administrative apparatus, the militarization of politics, the erosion of the civic identity that had once made a Roman legionary feel that he was fighting for something larger than himself. But all of those forces ran through a single channel. All of those currents converged in the decision to split what had been one into two, and in doing so, to fatally weaken the half that needed strength most. The Western Empire continued for another 66 years after the sack of Rome. But it was a zombie existence, the form without the substance, the name without the power. Province after province fell to Germanic kingdoms that were, ironically, deeply influenced by Rome, using Roman administrative structures, Roman law, Roman church organizations, Roman architectural techniques. The conquerors did not destroy Rome so much as absorb it, transform it, and carry pieces of it forward into the medieval world. But the unitary political structure that had unified the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries was gone. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a 16-year-old boy named Romulus Augustulus, whose very name seemed to mock the greatness of what had been, and simply did not bother to replace him. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a message saying that one emperor was sufficient for the whole empire. The Western Roman Empire did not end with a battle or a declaration or a dramatic last stand. It ended with a shrug. The eastern half, the Byzantine Empire as historians call it, survived for another 1,000 years, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. It preserved Roman law, Roman administrative practice, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology through the long dark centuries, passing them forward to the Renaissance and ultimately to the modern world. Without Byzantium, the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world might have been lost entirely. In that sense, Diocletian's division and Constantine's eastern turn was also a kind of salvation, just not for the West. The ruins of Rome's Western Empire lay scattered across a continent. The roads slowly crumbled. The aqueducts fell into disrepair. The great cities shrank, decade by decade, century by century, until the population of Rome itself, that million-person metropolis, declined to perhaps 20,000 souls huddled among the monuments of a vanished world, grazing cattle in the Forum, sheltering in the Colosseum, living in the shadow of achievements they could no longer understand or replicate. It would take Western Europe nearly 1,000 years to rebuild the infrastructure, the literacy rates, and the urban density that Rome had possessed at its height. Think about that. 1,000 years. 10 centuries of recovery from a single civilization's collapse. The libraries burned or rotted. The engineering knowledge lost. the legal traditions fragmented into a patchwork of incompatible local customs. The trade routes that had knit together an entire continent fell silent, and with them fell the agricultural surpluses, the specialized production, the economic complexity that had made Roman prosperity possible. People in 5th century Gaul or Britain or Spain were, in measurable material terms, significantly poorer than their grandparents had been. The life expectancy dropped, the diet narrowed, the world got smaller and darker and harder. And it had all begun, not with a barbarian army at the gates, not with a plague, not with some external catastrophe, but with a decision made in a palace by a man who was trying, in his way, to save the thing he ended up destroying. Diocletian stared at an empire in crisis and chose pragmatism over unity. He chose manageability over identity. He chose the rational solution to the immediate problem over the irrational, almost mystical belief that had held Rome together for centuries. The belief that there was one Rome, indivisible, eternal, unconquerable. When he divided the empire, he didn't just divide territory, he divided the idea. And ideas, it turns out, are more fragile and more powerful than any army. The Roman legions could hold a border against any physical enemy, but they could not hold together a civilization that had stopped believing in itself. History is full of these moments. Moments when a decision that seems logical, even necessary, carries within it the seed of something no one intended and no one could fully foresee. Moments when the cure and the disease are the same thing, separated only by time. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day or a year or even a century. It fell across generations, each one inheriting a slightly weaker structure, a slightly thinner margin, a slightly more divided sense of what Rome meant and whether it was worth fighting for. Until finally, in a moment of almost anticlimactic exhaustion, it simply stopped. The roads are still there, some of them. Walk across parts of England or France or Turkey, and you can still find the ancient stone pavement, worn smooth by 2,000 years of weather and feet and the passage of time. They run straight as thought, as Roman thought always did. Direct, purposeful, uncompromising. They are the bones of a dead civilization, still visible beneath the skin of the modern world. And if you stand on one of those roads on a quiet day and look down its length toward the horizon, you can almost feel the weight of what was lost. The order, the ambition, the impossible, magnificent, terrible belief that human beings, working together under a single law and a single authority, could build something that would last forever. Rome believed it had built that thing. For 500 years, it was right. And then it made a decision. And then it wasn't. If this story moves something in you, if the rise and fall of empires, the weight of decisions made in palaces and on battlefields, the question of why civilizations fall and what survives them, speaks to something you want to keep exploring, then stay with us. Subscribe. Share this with someone who still believes history is just a collection of dates. Because it isn't. It never was. It is a collection of decisions. And the ones that change everything are rarely the ones that look important at the time.